The whole world knew his name. Crowds filled giant football stadiums just to watch him play. Every time he touched the ball, thousands of fans stood on their feet. Children wore jerseys with his number. Sports reporters called him one of the greatest African football players of his generation. His face appeared on magazine covers, television screens, and billboards across different countries. His life looked perfect. He owned beautiful homes in different parts of the world. His garage held expensive cars that most people could only dream about. Shelves inside his mansion were covered with shining trophies, medals, and awards collected over many unforgettable seasons. Every week, he appeared in interviews where journalists praised his talent, discipline, and inspiring journey from poverty to success. People believed they knew his story. They talked about his victories, his championships, and the millions of dollars he earned. They admired the private jets, luxury vacations, and famous friends who surrounded him. But they never saw what happened after the cameras were turned off. Late at night, when the lights inside his mansion became quiet and the crowds disappeared, he often sat alone by a large window, staring into the darkness. No matter how far he traveled, one place always returned to him. His dreams never took him to the bright stadiums. They always took him back to the same dusty streets. He remembered the cracked walls of tiny houses built from old wood and rusty sheets of metal. He remembered walking barefoot on rough roads filled with mud after every rainstorm. He remembered standing in long lines with his mother just to collect a few containers of clean water. Some nights, he woke up breathing heavily. The memories felt so real that he could almost smell the smoke from cooking fires and hear children laughing as they chased a homemade football made from tied plastic bags. Those memories never left him. Success had changed his life, but it had never erased where he came from. One quiet morning, after another restless night, he made a decision that surprised even the people closest to him. "I'm going home," he said softly. He did not announce the trip. There were no reporters, no television cameras, no social media posts. Only a small team knew where he was going. Within hours, whispers began spreading through his hometown. "They say he's coming back." "Who?" "The football star." People laughed. "That's impossible. Why would someone like him come back here? He lives with millionaires now. He probably doesn't even remember this place." The rumors continued to spread from one narrow street to another. Old women talked while washing clothes. Young men discussed it outside small shops. Children repeated the story as they kicked old footballs across dusty roads. Most people refused to believe it. Why would one of the richest athletes in the world return to a forgotten slum? After all, nothing had changed. The neighborhood still struggled every single day. Many houses leaned dangerously to one side, their roofs patched together with pieces of rusted metal and worn-out plastic. Deep potholes filled the narrow roads, making every journey difficult. Dirty water collected in broken drains, leaving behind a heavy smell that never seemed to disappear. Families still searched for clean drinking water every morning. Parents worked long hours but barely earned enough to feed their children. Many young people had given up on their dreams because survival came first. Hope had become something people talked about rather than something they truly expected. The slum looked almost frozen in time. Years had passed. Governments had changed. Promises had been made. But poverty remained. As the afternoon sun began to fall, a strange silence slowly settled over the neighborhood. Someone pointed toward the entrance of the slum. Heads turned. Far in the distance, a shiny black SUV appeared. It moved slowly, carefully avoiding the broken road as it entered the narrow streets. The expensive vehicle looked completely out of place among the old houses and dusty paths. Children stopped playing. Shopkeepers stepped outside. Women paused in the middle of their conversations. Even the elderly men sitting beneath an old tree slowly stood to their feet. Nobody spoke. Every pair of eyes followed the black SUV as it rolled deeper into the neighborhood. Then someone whispered with trembling disbelief, It can't be." The vehicle came to a gentle stop. The driver's door opened. A polished black shoe touched the dusty ground. The entire neighborhood held its breath, waiting to see if the impossible had finally become real. The moment he stepped out of the black SUV, the world around him seemed to stand still. The expensive suit he wore, the polished shoes on his feet, and the watch shining on his wrist all reminded everyone how far he had come. But as he looked around, none of those things seemed to matter anymore. He slowly closed the car door and looked at the narrow street stretching before him. The road was still uneven. The old buildings still leaned against each other as if they were too tired to stand alone. Children stood quietly, watching him with wide eyes. Some recognized his face immediately. Others simply stared, wondering why such a famous man had come to a place that the rest of the world had forgotten. His security team waited nearby, but he gently raised his hand. "I'll walk alone." They nodded without saying a word. Taking a deep breath, he began walking through the familiar alleys. Every step felt heavier than the last. The dusty ground beneath his expensive shoes was the same ground his bare feet had once known so well. He reached out and lightly touched the cracked wall of an old house. For a moment, the years disappeared. Suddenly, he was no longer a world-famous football star. He was just a little boy again. Every afternoon after school, he had carried a wooden basket filled with bananas, oranges, and mangoes. He walked from house to house, calling out to anyone willing to buy fruit. Some people smiled and bought something. Others turned him away without even looking at him. There were days when he sold everything. There were many more when he returned home with most of the fruits still in the basket. His mother never complained. She simply smiled, divided the little food they had, and told him that tomorrow would be better. He kept walking. A small empty field appeared at the end of the alley. The sight made him stop. The field looked smaller than he remembered. The grass had disappeared years ago, leaving behind hard dirt and scattered rocks. A group of young boys were kicking around a football made from old plastic bags tied tightly together with rope. The simple ball rolled across the ground exactly like the one he had played with as a child. A gentle smile appeared on his face. He remembered spending every evening on that field. There had been no football boots, no uniforms, no coaches, just dreams. He and his friends played until darkness covered the sky. Sometimes they argued. Sometimes they laughed until their stomachs hurt. Sometimes they imagined playing in giant stadiums before thousands of cheering fans. Back then, those dreams had seemed almost impossible. Yet somehow, one of them had come true. The smile slowly disappeared. Not every dream had survived. He remembered Samuel. Samuel had been the fastest runner among them. Everyone believed he would become a great football player. But Samuel left school to help support his family. A few years later, he became trapped in a violent gang. One terrible night, he never came home. Then there was Musa. Quiet, kind, always sharing what little food he had. A sickness swept through the neighborhood before proper medicine could reach them. Musa was gone before his 15th birthday. There had been so many others. Friends whose laughter still echoed in his memory. Friends who never got the chance to escape. He lowered his head as sadness settled over him. "I wish you could have made it," he whispered. The afternoon breeze carried dust through the narrow streets as he continued walking. Finally, he reached the place he had been searching for. His old home. Or what remained of it. The tiny shack looked even smaller than he remembered. The wooden walls were cracked and weak. Large holes covered the rusted roof. The old door hung crooked on broken hinges. Nature had slowly begun reclaiming the place. Small weeds pushed through the dirt floor where his family had once shared meals. He stood silently in front of it. This was where his mother had tucked him into bed each night, even when they had nothing to eat. This was where rainwater dripped through the roof during storms. This was where he had stared through the broken window and dreamed about becoming someone who could change his family's life. He slowly stepped inside. The room was empty. Only silence remained. His eyes filled with tears. So little, and yet it was everything, he murmured. As he looked around, an old memory returned with perfect clarity. He saw himself sitting in the corner after another hungry night. His stomach hurt. His clothes were torn. Outside, rain poured from the sky. That frightened little boy had looked toward the leaking roof and made a promise. A promise that had carried him through every difficult training session, every painful defeat, and every lonely moment far from home. "If I ever become successful," he had whispered, "I will come back." Standing inside the broken shack years later, he realized he had finally kept that promise. But another painful truth stood before him. The neighborhood had not changed. The poverty was still here. The suffering was still here. The children were still chasing dreams with homemade footballs. His success had changed one life. It had not changed the place that had shaped him. As he stepped back outside, he looked down the long dusty street one more time. The memories no longer felt like ghosts. They felt like a calling. And deep inside his heart, he knew his journey home had only just begun. As the football star stepped away from the remains of his childhood home, the silence around him felt heavier than before. The memories of hunger, loss, and broken dreams stayed close to his heart. Every street seemed to whisper his name, reminding him of the boy he used to be. An elderly man sitting outside a small shop watched him for a long moment before speaking. "You've been looking around like you're searching for someone." The football star nodded. "There is someone I have to find." The old man studied his face carefully. Then a look of recognition crossed his eyes. "You mean Mama Grace." The football star's heart skipped a beat. You know where she is." The old man sighed and slowly pointed toward the far end of the neighborhood. "She still lives here." He paused for a moment before adding softly, "But life has not been kind to her." Without another word, the football star began walking. The road became narrower with every step. The houses looked even older than before. Pieces of rusted metal covered broken roofs, and worn-out clothes hung from ropes tied between small wooden poles. Finally, he stopped in front of a tiny shack. The walls leaned dangerously to one side. A faded curtain covered the doorway. A small bucket sat outside to catch water dripping from a hole in the roof. His heart sank. Could this really be where she lived? Years ago, Mama Grace had been one of the strongest women in the neighborhood. She sold homemade bread every morning before sunrise. She laughed loudly. She worked harder than anyone else. And somehow, even when she had almost nothing, she always found a way to help others. Especially one hungry little boy. He slowly pushed the curtain aside. Inside, the room was dark. A small bed stood against the wall. An old wooden chair sat beside a tiny table with a few medicine bottles resting on top. On the bed lay a thin elderly woman wrapped in a worn blanket. Her hair had turned completely grey. Her face carried the marks of a lifetime filled with struggle. For a moment, he could hardly recognize her. She slowly opened her eyes after hearing the footsteps. Her vision was weak. She blinked several times. Then she smiled. "My boy." His breath caught in his throat. She had recognized him immediately. Not as the famous football star the world admired, but as the little boy she had loved like her own son. Tears filled his eyes. "Mama Grace." He rushed to her bedside and gently took her hands. They felt cold and fragile. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. They simply looked at each other. Years of separation disappeared in silence. Then she gently laughed. "I told everyone you would come back one day." He lowered his head, unable to hold back his tears. "I'm sorry it took me so long." She slowly shook her head. "No. You came home. That's all that matters." As they sat together, old memories came flooding back. He remembered countless evenings when he returned home after selling fruit with nothing left to eat. His mother often pretended she wasn't hungry so he could have the last piece of bread. Some nights, there wasn't even bread. Whenever Mama Grace noticed, she quietly invited him inside. She would place a warm bowl of soup in front of him. "Eat," she always said with a smile. A growing boy needs strength. Only years later did he realize she had often given him her own dinner. He remembered another afternoon when older boys surrounded him after a football match. They laughed at his torn clothes and tried to steal the homemade football he treasured. Before he could defend himself, Mama Grace appeared. She stood between him and the gang with nothing but a walking stick in her hands. "You touch this boy," she warned, "and you'll answer to me." The boys ran away without another word. He had never forgotten that day. She had protected him when no one else did. Then came another memory. The day he wanted to quit football. He had returned home after losing an important local match. Some people laughed at him. Others said football was only for rich children who could afford proper boots. He had thrown the homemade ball into a corner and declared he would never play again. Mama Grace picked up the ball. She dusted it off. Then she placed it back into his hands. "Listen to me carefully," she had said. "People can take your money. They can laugh at your clothes. They can even break your heart. But never let anyone steal your dream." Those words had stayed with him through every difficult year of his career. Now, sitting beside a bed, he realized those simple words had changed his entire life. He looked around the small room. The roof leaked. The furniture was falling apart. There was almost no food in sight. Medicine bottles sat nearly empty. A painful question escaped his lips. "Who has been taking care of you?" Mama Grace smiled gently. "The neighbors help when they can. But everyone here is struggling." He looked away, unable to hide the guilt on his face. The woman who had fed hungry children now barely had enough to survive herself. The woman who had protected others had been left alone. His voice trembled. "I became rich. I built houses. I traveled the world. But I never knew you were living like this." She squeezed his hand. "My son, I never wanted your money. I only wanted to know that the little boy who dreamed so big never stopped believing." He broke down completely. Tears rolled freely down his face as he knelt beside her bed. "I wouldn't be here without you. You believed in me before the world even knew my name." She gently placed her trembling hand on his head, just as she had done when he was a frightened child. "I always knew your greatest victory would not happen on a football field." He looked up through his tears. She smiled with quiet wisdom. "It would happen the day you remembered where you came from." Those words settled deep inside his heart. At that moment, he understood something no trophy, championship, or fortune had ever taught him. True success was not measured by fame, wealth, or applause. It was measured by how faithfully you honored the people who believed in you before anyone else did. As he carefully helped Mama Grace sit more comfortably, a new promise formed inside him. This time, he would not simply visit. He was going to change her life, and the lives of everyone who still called this forgotten neighborhood home. Outside the small shack, the evening sun slowly disappeared behind the broken rooftops, signaling that an even greater journey was about to begin. The next morning, the football star woke before sunrise. He had spent the night thinking about Mama Grace. Her gentle smile, her weak hands, and the empty room where she lived stayed in his mind. The more he thought about her, the more he realized how many people in the neighborhood had been left behind. As the first rays of sunlight reached the dusty streets, word spread quickly. "The football star is still here." People gathered outside small shops and at street corners, hoping to catch another glimpse of him. Some came out of curiosity. Others came with hope. A few came with anger hidden behind polite smiles. Instead of returning to his luxury hotel, he chose to walk through the neighborhood once again. This time, familiar voices called his name. "Is that really you?" He turned and saw a man smiling as he hurried toward him. For a second, he couldn't recognize the face. Then the memories came rushing back. "David." The man laughed and wrapped him in a warm embrace. "I knew you'd remember me." The two old friends held each other tightly. Years melted away in that single moment. David had been his closest teammate on the dusty football field. They had shared dreams, food, and endless afternoons chasing a homemade ball. "I've watched every match you've ever played," David said proudly. "Every goal felt like a victory for all of us." The football star smiled. "So you're still the loudest supporter I ever had." Both men laughed. Soon, more familiar faces appeared. Some hugged him. Some shook his hand with excitement. Others simply stood nearby, smiling with pride. "We always knew you'd make it. You've made our whole neighborhood proud. Our children look up to you." Their words warmed his heart. For a little while, everything felt joyful. But happiness did not last long. As more people gathered, he began noticing the truth hidden behind their smiles. David's clothes were faded and worn. His shoes were held together with pieces of wire. His hands were rough from years of hard labor. "What do you do now?" the football star asked gently. David smiled, but sadness filled his eyes. "I carry heavy bags at the market. Every day. Some days I earn enough. Some days I don't. I work from sunrise until dark." He looked down at his hands. And somehow, it's still never enough. The football star felt a sharp pain in his chest. David had once dreamed of becoming a teacher. That dream had disappeared beneath years of survival. As they continued walking, another familiar face appeared. This time, the reunion felt different. A tall man leaned against the wall of an old building. His face carried scars. His eyes were hard. He crossed his arms without smiling. "You've changed." The football star looked at him carefully. "Joseph." Joseph gave a slow nod. I didn't think you'd recognize me." The football star stepped forward, hoping for a handshake. Joseph didn't move. Silence filled the air. Finally, Joseph spoke. "You're lucky." The words were simple, but they carried years of bitterness. "I wasn't lucky," the football star answered quietly. "I worked for every chance I got." Joseph looked away. "Maybe. Or maybe you just escaped while the rest of us stayed trapped." No one spoke. The tension grew heavier. David gently changed the subject before the conversation became worse. But the football star couldn't stop thinking about Joseph's words. As he walked farther through the neighborhood, more painful stories unfolded. He found Isaac sitting outside a small room with empty bottles scattered nearby. Isaac had once been the funniest boy among them. Now his hands shook as he struggled to stand. Years of addiction had stolen the bright future everyone believed he would have. "I had dreams too," Isaac whispered with tears in his eyes. "I just lost my way." The football star embraced him without saying a word. Later that afternoon, he met Samuel's younger brother. Samuel's story still haunted him. His brother quietly explained how violence had taken more young lives over the years. So many boys followed the wrong people. They didn't see another way. Each conversation became harder than the last. Every face reminded him that success had not reached everyone. Some had survived. Many had simply endured. By evening, a heavy question filled his mind. Why had fate chosen him? Why had he escaped when so many others remained trapped? For the first time in years, he wondered if leaving the neighborhood had been both the greatest blessing and the deepest burden of his life. As the sun began to set, whispers started spreading through the streets. Not everyone was happy to see him. A group of men stood outside a small store, speaking quietly. "He came here in expensive cars. Did you see his watch? It probably costs more than all these houses." Another man laughed bitterly. "Rich people always come back for one reason: to remind us how poor we are." Someone else added, "He'll stay for a few days. Take some pictures. Then disappear again." The rumors moved quickly from house to house. He only came to show off. He wants everyone to admire him. He forgot us years ago. The football star noticed the changing expressions around him. People who had smiled earlier now watched him with doubt. Some stopped waving. Others turned away as he passed. He felt the distance growing. Not because of money, but because of misunderstanding. He wanted to explain why he had returned. He wanted to tell them about the promise he had made as a little boy. But he stayed silent. He knew words alone would not heal years of disappointment. Only actions could do that. As darkness covered the neighborhood, he stood alone at the edge of the old football field. Children were still playing barefoot under the fading light, chasing another homemade ball across the dusty ground. He watched them quietly. Behind him, the whispers continued to spread. Ahead of him, the children kept dreaming. He realized that winning back the trust of the community would be far harder than winning any football championship. And somewhere in the shadows, unseen eyes were already watching him closely, waiting for the perfect moment to turn the neighborhood against the man who had finally come home. That night, the football star sat alone inside a small guest house on the edge of the neighborhood. Outside, the streets slowly became quiet. The voices of children faded. The small shops closed one by one. Only the sound of crickets and distant barking dogs filled the warm night air. But inside the room, sleep refused to come. The hurtful whispers he had heard earlier echoed in his mind. He only came to show off. He forgot us. He'll leave again. He closed his eyes and let out a slow breath. If only they knew the truth. Slowly, he stood up and walked toward an old leather travel bag resting beside the bed. He unzipped it carefully. Inside, beneath neatly folded clothes and important documents, was a small wooden box. It was old. The corners were worn smooth with age. He lifted it gently, almost as if he were afraid it might break. When he opened it, several childhood treasures rested inside. A faded photograph of his family. A small whistle he had once used while playing football. A medal from his very first youth tournament. And beneath them all, a folded piece of yellowed paper. His hands trembled as he picked it up. He had carried that letter with him everywhere. Through every country. Every championship. Every victory. Every defeat. It was the last letter his mother had ever written. She had given it to him only a few days before she passed away. At the time, he had been a young football player preparing to leave home for the biggest opportunity of his life. His mother had been weak, but her smile had never faded. She placed the letter in his hands. "Don't read it until you're ready," she had whispered. Years later, after becoming a professional footballer, he had finally opened it. Now, sitting quietly beneath the dim light, he unfolded it once again. The paper had become fragile, but every word remained clear. "My dear son, if you are reading this, then God has taken me home. Do not cry for me. Instead, thank Him for every blessing He gives you. I know you are chasing a dream bigger than this little neighborhood. Go. Run toward it with all your heart. Do not let fear stop you. One day, people may know your name. One day, you may become successful beyond anything we ever imagined. But promise me one thing." He paused. His eyes filled with tears as he continued reading. "Never be ashamed of where you came from. The streets that made you strong. The hunger that taught you gratitude. The pain that taught you kindness. Those things are not your weakness. They are your greatest strength." A tear rolled down his cheek. He remembered reading those words for the first time. They had carried him through every difficult moment of his career. But the final part of the letter had changed his life forever. If God blesses you with success, go back. Find the children who still sleep hungry. Find the boys who play football with bare feet. Find the girls who dream of going to school but cannot afford books. Help them. Give them the chances life never gave us. That will be your greatest victory. Not the trophies. Not the money. Not the applause. The lives you change. He slowly lowered the letter. The room became silent once again. He looked toward the window, where the lights of the neighborhood flickered in the darkness. "I kept my promise, Mama," he whispered. "But I'm only just beginning." The next morning, before anyone in the neighborhood was awake, a small meeting quietly took place inside the guest house. Only 4 people sat around the table. His longtime manager, a trusted architect, a lawyer who had worked with his charity for years, and his childhood friend, David. Everyone knew the meeting had to remain secret. The football star spread several large blueprints across the table. David stared in surprise. "What are these?" The football star smiled. "The future." The first blueprint showed a beautiful football academy. A large training field stretched across the page. There were proper changing rooms, classrooms, a gym, and safe places where young players could learn and grow. "No child here should have to chase a dream with a ball made from plastic bags," he said quietly. The second blueprint revealed a modern school. Bright classrooms, a library filled with books, science laboratories, computers, a cafeteria where children would receive healthy meals every day. "Education should never be a luxury," he said. "They deserve the same opportunities as any child in the world." Then came the third plan. A medical clinic. Small but fully equipped. Doctors, nurses, medicine, emergency care. David looked at him with wide eyes. How many lives could this save? The football star answered softly. "Hopefully, all the ones we couldn't save before." Samuel, Musa. The names silently passed through both of their minds. Next came another drawing. A colorful playground. Slides, swings, football courts, basketball hoops. Safe spaces where children could laugh instead of worrying about violence. David smiled for the first time that morning. "I've never seen anything like this." "There never was anything like this," the football star replied. Finally, he placed one last folder on the table. Across the front were simple words. Children's Scholarship Fund. No talented child should ever quit school because their parents are poor. We'll pay their school fees. Books. Uniforms. Everything. The room fell silent. Even the architect looked emotional. David slowly shook his head. "You've been planning this for a long time." The football star nodded. "For years. I just needed the right moment." His manager leaned forward. "Should we announce everything today?" The football star immediately shook his head. "No, not yet. They already think I came here for attention. If we make promises before taking action, they'll never believe us." He looked around the table. "We'll let our work speak first," Everyone agreed. The meeting ended quietly. The blueprints were carefully packed away. No reporters knew. No cameras were invited. No speeches were prepared. Only a handful of trusted people understood what was about to happen. Outside, the neighborhood carried on as usual. Children chased another homemade football across the dusty field. Parents left for work before sunrise. Mothers stood in long lines to collect clean water. No one realized that, behind the silence, the biggest transformation in the history of the neighborhood had already begun. The football star stood outside the guest house, watching the children play. Some people still looked at him with suspicion. Others continued whispering behind his back. He simply smiled. Soon, they would understand. He had not returned to remind them of what he had become. He had returned to make sure the next generation would never have to live the life he had survived. And somewhere beyond the dusty streets, hidden from everyone except a trusted few, the first steps toward a new future were already in motion. For 2 days, everything remained quiet. The football star continued walking through the neighborhood without making any public announcements. He visited families, listened to their stories, and quietly wrote down what they needed most. He smiled at children playing football in the dusty streets. He greeted elderly neighbors with respect. He spent hours beside Mama Grace, making sure she received proper medical care. To many people, it looked like he was simply reconnecting with his past. But behind the scenes, the plans for the football academy, school, medical clinic, and scholarship fund were moving forward. Unfortunately, secrets never stay hidden for long. One afternoon, inside a large house at the center of the neighborhood, several local leaders gathered around a wooden table. These were men who had controlled the community for years. Whenever charities arrived, they collected the donations. Whenever government aid came, they decided who received it. And somehow, they always became richer while the neighborhood remained poor. One of them slammed his hand on the table. So, it's true. The football star wants to build something here. Another man nodded. My cousin works at the city office. He has already asked about land records. The room fell silent. Then the oldest man smiled. If he's planning to spend millions, we should be the ones controlling that money. The others slowly smiled. Greed had already begun to replace reason. The very next morning, the football star received unexpected visitors. 5 well-dressed men approached him with friendly smiles. One stepped forward and stretched out his hand. Welcome home, my son. We are the official representatives of the community. The football star politely shook his hand. It's good to meet you. The men spoke warmly. They praised his success. They called him a hero. They thanked him for remembering his roots. Then their leader leaned closer. We've heard that you want to help the neighborhood. The football star remained careful. I want to understand what people need. The man's smile grew wider. Excellent. Then simply give the money to us. We'll handle everything. The football star looked at him quietly. I appreciate the offer. But I'd rather make sure every project is completed personally. For the first time, the smiles began to disappear. The leader cleared his throat. My son, you are busy. You travel the world. You don't understand local matters. We know what's best. The football star answered respectfully but firmly. I came here because I care. And I will personally oversee every project. The meeting ended politely. But as the men walked away, their expressions turned cold. He doesn't trust us. No. Worse. He's getting in our way. Within hours, a new plan was born. If they couldn't control him, they would destroy his reputation. The rumors began quietly. He promised millions but hasn't given anyone a single coin. He only wants publicity. The cameras will come soon. He'll leave after making empty promises. By the end of the week, the lies had spread through nearly every corner of the neighborhood. People repeated them without asking questions. Some believed them immediately. Others weren't sure what to think. Even families who had welcomed him warmly now looked uncertain. The football star noticed the change. Conversations stopped when he walked past. People whispered behind closed doors. Children were pulled away by cautious parents. The growing distance hurt him more than he expected. Then came an even bigger problem. One evening, David rushed into the guest house with panic on his face. They've done something. What happened? The football star asked. They've claimed the old football field. The football star stood up immediately. What do you mean? They've registered the land under a private company. David's voice shook with anger. The same land where you planned to build the academy. The room fell silent. The football star stared at the blueprint spread across the table. That field wasn't just empty land. It was where his dream had begun. Where barefoot children still played every evening. If they lost that field, the academy could never be built. The next morning, he walked there himself. A large wooden sign had already been placed at the entrance. Private property. No trespassing. Children stood outside the fence, holding their homemade football. They looked confused. One little boy quietly asked, "Where are we supposed to play now?" The football star couldn't answer. His heart felt heavy. As he turned to leave, several people watched from nearby houses. Instead of sympathy, many simply shook their heads. "We told you." Nothing ever changes. He made promises he can't keep. He should have stayed where he belongs. Each word cut deeper than the last. That evening, even the local radio station repeated the false stories. The famous football star's development plans remain uncertain. Some residents claim he is using the community for publicity. By nightfall, reporters began calling his manager. Social media exploded with rumors. Some people defended him. Others mocked him. His name, once praised around the world, was now being questioned in the very place he loved most. Late that night, he returned alone to the old football field. The moonlight stretched across the empty dirt where children usually laughed and played. Now there was only silence. He sat on the ground and lowered his head. "I failed," he whispered. For the first time since returning home, doubt filled his heart. Maybe Joseph had been right. Maybe he had stayed away too long. Maybe the neighborhood no longer wanted him. Maybe he could never repair what years of absence had broken. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his mother's letter. He read the final lines once more. "Help them." He closed his eyes tightly. "But what if they don't want my help anymore?" he whispered into the darkness. At that moment, exhaustion overwhelmed him. He quietly stood. He walked back toward the guest house. When he reached the door, he looked one last time at the sleeping neighborhood. His manager noticed the sadness on his face. "What are you thinking?" The football star answered after a long silence. "Maybe it's time for me to leave." Those words hung heavily in the air. Neither man noticed the shadowy figure standing across the street, watching them from the darkness. The corrupt leaders believed they had almost won. The community was divided. The football star's hope was fading, and it seemed that everything he had returned to build was about to collapse before it had even begun. The morning after the football star decided he might leave, the neighborhood woke to an unusual feeling. The streets were quiet. The whispers had slowed. But beneath the silence, something was beginning to change. David had spent the entire night talking to people he trusted. One by one, honest residents came forward. They had seen too much for too many years. They knew where donated food had disappeared. They knew who had taken money meant for the poor. They knew who had claimed public land for themselves. For years, they had remained silent because they were afraid. Now, they realized they had one last chance to tell the truth. By mid-morning, a crowd gathered in the open square near the old football field. The football star stood at the edge of the crowd with his manager, unsure why everyone had been called together. He expected more accusations. Instead, David stepped forward. His voice was calm but strong. "Today, we must stop lying to ourselves." The crowd fell silent. David looked toward the local leaders standing confidently near the front. "For years, we've blamed everyone except the people who have been stealing from us." The leaders immediately interrupted him. "Careful with your words." But David refused to back down. "I am careful. I am also telling the truth." He held up several folders. Inside were copies of land records, missing donation reports, and financial documents collected by honest volunteers. The football academy land was never sold legally. The documents were changed. The signatures were forged. Gasps spread through the crowd. People turned toward the local leaders in disbelief. Another resident stepped forward. An elderly schoolteacher. "I taught many of your children," she said. I watched supplies arrive for our classrooms. But they never reached us. She pointed toward one of the leaders. Because they disappeared into your warehouses. Soon another voice joined. Then another. Then another. A local nurse admitted that medicine donated to the neighborhood clinic had vanished before reaching patients. A shop owner described being forced to pay illegal fees every month. A former city worker revealed that public funds meant for clean water had been redirected for private projects. The truth poured out like rain after years of drought. The corrupt leaders looked around nervously. Their confident smiles were gone. But then something unexpected happened. The crowd slowly parted. An old wheelchair rolled forward. Everyone turned in surprise. It was Mama Grace. Though she was weak, her eyes remained bright. David carefully helped her to the front. She looked around at the people she had known for decades. Many lowered their heads with respect. She took a slow breath before speaking. I have lived in this neighborhood longer than most of you. Her voice was soft. But every person listened. I remember a little boy who walked these streets with torn clothes and empty pockets. She looked toward the football star. He sold fruit after school. He played football with bare feet. He went to sleep hungry more nights than anyone should. Silence covered the square. I watched his mother skip meals so he could eat. I watched him cry because he thought poverty would last forever. Her eyes filled with tears. But I also watched him refuse to give up. She smiled gently. Every time someone laughed at his dream. He practiced harder. Every time life knocked him down. He stood up again. She looked at the crowd. You celebrate his success today. But you did not see the thousands of days when nobody believed in him. The football star lowered his head, overwhelmed by emotion. Mama Grace continued. When he left this neighborhood, he didn't leave because he wanted to escape us. He left because he wanted to create a better future. She slowly reached into the small bag resting on her lap. From inside, she removed an old envelope. I have kept this for many years. She handed it to David. It is a copy of the letter his mother showed me before she died. David carefully unfolded the paper and began reading aloud. As the crowd listened, they heard the words of a mother's final wish. Never forget where you came from. Help the children. Return one day. Change lives. By the time he finished reading, many people were wiping tears from their eyes. The neighborhood finally understood. The football star had not returned for attention. He had returned to keep a promise. The rumors suddenly felt small. The expensive car no longer mattered. The designer clothes no longer mattered. Only his heart mattered. One by one, people stepped toward him. An elderly man spoke first. We judged you too quickly. A young mother lowered her eyes. I'm sorry. Joseph slowly walked forward. The same man who had once accused him of being lucky now stood in silence. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Joseph quietly said, I carried my pain for so many years that I couldn't see your kindness. I'm sorry. The football star looked into his old friend's eyes. He saw regret instead of anger. Without hesitation, he embraced him. I'm not here to blame anyone. I'm here to help. The crowd watched in silence. No one had expected forgiveness. Many expected revenge. Instead, they witnessed compassion. The football star then turned toward the corrupt leaders. Some tried to leave quietly, but the community stopped them. The people who had remained silent for years now stood together. We want answers. You stole from us. You lied to us. For the first time in many years, the leaders had no power left. Their influence disappeared as quickly as it had been built. The neighborhood had finally found its voice. As the meeting came to an end, something beautiful happened. People who had spent years divided by fear and suspicion began talking to one another. Neighbors embraced. Old arguments were forgotten. Children laughed together again on the edge of the dusty football field. The football star looked around with tears in his eyes. This was the neighborhood he remembered. Not because it was free from poverty, but because hope had returned. Mama Grace smiled proudly from her wheelchair. She quietly whispered, I knew the truth would find its way home. The football star gently took her hand. Then he looked across the old football field one more time. This time, he no longer saw an empty piece of land. He saw the beginning of a future that the entire community would build together. And for the first time since he had returned, he truly believed that nothing could stop them now. Only a few weeks after the truth came to light, the neighborhood woke to a sound it had not heard in years. The sound of hope. Heavy construction trucks slowly rolled into the slum as the morning sun rose over the old rooftops. Workers unloaded bricks, steel beams, bags of cement, and building tools. Engineers carefully measured the land while architects studied detailed blueprints. For the first time in decades, people were gathering not because of trouble, but because something beautiful was finally beginning. Children stood along the roadside, watching with excitement. "Are they really building it?" one little girl asked. Her father smiled with tears in his eyes. "Yes. This time, it's real." The football star stood quietly beside David, watching the first shovel break the dry ground of the old football field. Years ago, this same field had been nothing more than hard dirt covered with stones. Now it would become a place where dreams could grow. He closed his eyes for a moment. He imagined himself as the barefoot little boy who had once chased a homemade football across this very ground. If someone had told that little boy what would happen here one day, he never would have believed it. As construction continued, changes spread throughout the neighborhood faster than anyone expected. The first delivery arrived only days later. Several large trucks stopped near the community center. Children rushed toward them with curious eyes. When the back doors opened, colorful boxes filled the trucks from floor to ceiling. Inside were brand new footballs, football boots in every size, team jerseys, goalkeeper gloves, training cones, water bottles, whistles, even proper goal nets. The football star personally handed the first football to a young boy who had always played with a ball made from tied plastic bags. The boy stared at it in disbelief. His small hands carefully touched the smooth leather. I've never held a real football before." The football star smiled warmly. "I used to dream about this moment too." The boy hugged the football tightly against his chest as if it were the greatest treasure in the world. Soon the field filled with laughter. Children kicked real footballs across fresh grass for the very first time. Parents watched from the sidelines, many unable to hold back tears. Dreams that once felt impossible suddenly felt within reach. But football was only the beginning. Across the neighborhood, another building slowly took shape. Bright yellow walls replaced broken wooden classrooms. Large windows filled each room with sunlight. Shelves overflowed with books. Computers lined a brand new learning center. Colorful maps and science posters decorated the walls. On opening day, hundreds of children walked through the school gates wearing clean uniforms and carrying new backpacks. Some had never owned a single textbook before. A little girl ran her fingers across the pages of a new book. "It even smells new," she whispered with a smile. Nearby, teachers welcomed every student by name. No child was turned away because their family could not afford school fees. The scholarship fund quietly covered every expense. Not far from the school, another miracle was taking shape. The new medical clinic opened its doors. Doctors and nurses arrived from nearby cities. Modern medical equipment replaced empty shelves. Medicine became available for families who had gone years without proper treatment. Mothers no longer feared that a simple illness might become a tragedy. Children received vaccinations. Elderly neighbors received regular checkups. For the first time in many years, healthcare became a right instead of a dream. Everywhere the football star looked, life was changing. The dusty streets slowly became cleaner. Broken playgrounds were replaced with safe places where children laughed from sunrise until sunset. The sound of fear faded. The sound of hope grew louder every day. A few months later, the football academy officially opened. Dozens of young boys and girls lined up wearing matching training uniforms. Professional coaches greeted them with smiles. The football star stood in the center of the beautiful green field. Looking around, he saw pieces of his own childhood reflected in every hopeful face. Children who once believed poverty would decide their future now believed hard work could change it. As the first training session began, cheers echoed throughout the neighborhood. Parents applauded from the stands. David stood beside the football star with tears in his eyes. "You kept your promise." The football star quietly answered, "We all did." But there was one person he wanted to share this moment with more than anyone else. Every evening after construction finished, he visited Mama Grace. Although her body had grown weaker, her spirit remained strong. From her wheelchair, She watched children carrying footballs instead of homemade plastic bags. She watched students walking proudly into their new classrooms. She watched families leaving the clinic with smiles instead of fear. One afternoon, the football star gently wheeled her to the edge of the academy field. Children laughed as they trained. Their voices filled the air with joy. Mama Grace watched them for a long time. A peaceful smile slowly spread across her face. "They're safe now," she whispered. The football star knelt beside her. "They're going to have the chances we never had." She gently squeezed his hand. "I always knew you would come back." Her breathing became slower. She looked toward the bright blue sky one final time. Then she softly said, "Your mother would be so proud." A single tear rolled down the football star's face. "Thank you for believing in me when no one else did." Mama Grace smiled one last time. Without fear. Without pain. Surrounded by the sounds of children laughing and dreams being born, she peacefully closed her eyes. The woman who had fed hungry children, protected frightened boys, and never stopped believing, left the world knowing that her kindness had changed not just one life, but countless generations. The entire neighborhood gathered to honor her. On the day of the academy's grand opening, the football star stood before hundreds of families. Behind him stood the beautiful new building that had once existed only as a dream. A large stone monument covered by a cloth waited beside the entrance. He slowly stepped forward. "My greatest victories were never the trophies I won," he said. "They were the people who believed in me before I believed in myself." With gentle hands, he pulled away the cloth. The crowd applauded as golden letters shone in the sunlight. "The Grace and Hope Football Academy, dedicated to my beloved mother, who taught me compassion, and to Mama Grace, who taught me never to stop believing." Many people wiped tears from their eyes. The football star looked across the field where children were already running after football. Years earlier, he had stood on this same ground with empty pockets and impossible dreams. Now those dreams belonged to every child in the neighborhood. And as the cheers of the next generation filled the air, he realized that this was not the end of his journey. It was the beginning of a future that would continue long after he was gone. Years passed, and the neighborhood that had once been known only for poverty slowly became a symbol of hope. Visitors who had not returned for many years could hardly believe their eyes. The broken roads had been repaired. Fresh paint covered homes that had once looked forgotten. Trees lined the streets where piles of trash had once collected. Children walked safely to school every morning with books in their hands instead of worry in their hearts. The change was not perfect. Life still brought challenges. But something important had changed forever. People no longer believed that poverty was their destiny. They believed in tomorrow. The football star returned often, not as a celebrity, but as a familiar face. He walked through the neighborhood without bodyguards, greeting old neighbors by name. Every visit reminded him that dreams could become stronger when they were shared. The greatest change could not be seen in buildings alone. It could be seen in people. The young men who once stood on street corners with no direction were now working as coaches, teachers, builders, and business owners. Many of them had found jobs through the projects built in the community. Crime, which had once stolen so many young lives, had dropped year after year. The sound of sirens became rare. The sound of children laughing became common. Inside the modern school, classrooms were filled with students who believed that education could open doors their parents had never been allowed to enter. Teachers spoke proudly about children who dreamed of becoming doctors, engineers, nurses, teachers, and community leaders. No one laughed at those dreams anymore. At the football academy, another generation was growing. Every afternoon, the field echoed with the sound of footballs rolling across fresh green grass. Young boys and girls trained with discipline, respect, and confidence. They wore proper boots. They drank clean water. They learned that success was built through hard work, teamwork, and character. The football star often stood quietly near the sidelines, watching practice without saying much. One afternoon, a coach ran toward him with excitement. "We have wonderful news." The football star smiled. "What happened?" The coach handed him a letter. "Amina has been selected." He opened the envelope carefully. His eyes filled with pride as he read the words. One of the academy's brightest young players had earned a full international football scholarship. She would travel overseas to continue both her education and her football career. The football star looked across the field. Amina was laughing with her teammates, completely unaware that her life had just changed forever. He remembered another child. A barefoot boy carrying a homemade football made from plastic bags. A boy who once stood on this very ground, believing his dreams were too big for a forgotten neighborhood. That boy had been him. Now another dream was taking flight. He walked toward Amina and handed her the letter. She read it once. Then again. Her hands began to shake. Is this real? She whispered. He smiled. It's real. Tears streamed down her face as she hugged him tightly. I'll make you proud. The football star gently shook his head. No. Make yourself proud. And when you succeed. He paused with a warm smile. Come back. Help the next child. She nodded through her tears. I promise. As the years continued to pass, the academy became known across the country. The school graduated students who returned as teachers. The clinic saved thousands of lives. The scholarship fund opened doors that had once been locked by poverty. The neighborhood was no longer remembered for what it lacked. It was remembered for what it had become. One quiet evening, the football star stood alone beside the statue outside the academy. It honored two women. His beloved mother. And Mama Grace. Fresh flowers rested beneath their names. He smiled softly. You were both right, he whispered. This is the greatest victory of my life. He looked toward the football field one last time. The setting sun painted the sky with warm shades of gold and orange. Dozens of children laughed as they chased a football across the beautiful green grass. Their joyful voices filled the air. They had no idea that years earlier, a frightened little boy had played on the same ground with bare feet, an empty stomach, and nothing but hope. Now they played with confidence. With opportunity. With dreams that no longer seemed impossible. The football star realized something that no trophy cabinet could ever teach him. Championships fade. Records are broken. Fame eventually disappears. But a life changed with kindness can continue changing other lives for generations. He turned away from the field with peace in his heart, knowing that his greatest legacy had never been the goals he scored. It was the futures he helped create. And as the laughter of children echoed through the neighborhood that had once forgotten how to hope, one truth became clear.